Well, tonight's topic, we're going to jump into help for the aging brain, and I want to preface this just a little bit because when I developed this workshop, I think it was last fall, and the thought around it was because we know that as we age, we're dealing with aging of any kind. It doesn't just mean the brain, it means our total body. And there's a ton of research that's going on right now in this whole arena. And we're talking about like the genome, which is, our genetic pool, so to speak. And so as we start to talk about aging, why is it that some people age very well and very gracefully and have good health, while other people age accelerated in an accelerated fashion? And so we start looking at all that, and it's not just genetics. And it's pretty fascinating when we start to look at that whole aspect. So we thought that help for the aging brain because the brain is the master organ. Without a brain, we're brain dead. So anyway, you've heard the term. We all use it loosely at times, right? So anyway, the thing we want to look at is, though, that when we start to look at statistics, we look at the last 20, 30 years, we didn't used to hear and talk about in the news all the time about Alzheimer's and dementia, and we didn't, and all of those kinds of aspects. And so we see a lot of this increase. We have more population, yes, but why is it that we have more of these issues? We're going to talk about some of that tonight. It is an involved topic, and I'm going to try and get through it without boring you. Some of it will be a little technical, nothing major. There's no test you have to worry about, so don't worry about that. And so we're going to look at this from the different angles and different aspects so that when you walk away, you'll have a different understanding about what you can do from a preventive perspective. What you do every day in your lifestyle is what makes a difference. You've got to remember that. It's what you eat, it's what you breathe, what you drink. These are all factors. We're faced with a lot of challenges today in our world that we have to pay attention to. I like this slide that has no pertinence other than the fact of the left brain, right brain. And there are some, when you start to look at mental health and things, you can see, left brain's logic, analytical, science, math, all that kind of stuff. Then you look at the left brain, and it's more of the intuitive, the more creative, those more sometimes spiritual, emotional aspects of what we deal with when we talk about consciousness and we talk about brain health. So I just like the slide. Thought it was a good summarization of kind of the work that our brain does. In right brain, left brain has communication between both, and some people are more left-oriented, others are more right-oriented. So it's just a thought, just something to think about. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about. The brain itself, we're going to talk about some of the physiology, because there's a rhyme and a reason to why things work. We'll talk about the brain-gut relationship because there is a direct correlation now been established even in research science that talks about what goes on in this gut digestive system is also relative to how our brains function and work. We'll talk about brain nutrients, brain herbals. We'll talk about how we need to pay attention to detoxification processes in our body because it translates into the brain also. And then we'll talk about a little bit of some different protocols. Okay, the brain, the fun part, huh? Master organ, orchestrates everything. Very complex. So what we'll talk about is how nutrition and what you do every day can really make a difference in how that all is going to work. Science has gained many insights, like I said, so that we know that supplementation. We know that when we have dysfunction, that the root causes of disease are all based a lot of times in inflammation. You've heard me talk about inflammation a lot. There's also this whole inflammatory process that can be involved in brain health too. And it can be at such a low level that we don't realize that it's interrupting so many of our potential functions. Many suffer from neurological diseases, again, MS, Alzheimer's, attention deficit, Parkinson's, ALS. There's all types of mood disorders from manic depressive to, or what they call now a bipolar. There's all this stuff going on. And it's interesting. I went to a conference 3 weeks ago down in North Carolina, and the whole theme of the conference was mental health. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about mental health tonight, but what we're going to talk about is the fact that in the lectures that I sat in on, there was a common thread throughout the whole entire conference that was dealing with some of the same information, but coming at it from different perspectives. So we could see it from the gut perspective, you could see it from plant perspective. There were medical doctors there, there was research scientists there who were doing lectures on essential fatty acids. We're going to talk about some of that information. So it's pretty neat stuff. 6 general functions is what we call the brain. It's basically, these are the things that are broken down when you start to look at this in books. You know, it's a regulating center of the body, receives information, senses, impulses. You know, I always tell people, you know, your tongue, you know, is an organ because it has the sensory 5 tastes, or some culture 6 tastes. That all correlates back up into the brain. That's how that works. So it's pretty neat. So when you chew food and when you eat food, you've got a sensory organ into your tongue that is designed to kind of start to set the processes for other things that are going to come about in your body as you digest your food. So that's things to keep thinking about. Okay. If they say it's the center of consciousness, that is debatable. There are some cultures that believe that this is the center of consciousness. Okay? How do we know it's in the head? How do we know it's the brain? But not for me to determine, is it? You can believe however you choose. So anyway, I have to question that, even though they say it's the center. It depends on who you write and who you read, so keep that in mind. It's a receiver and interpretation of, again, all senses, and it is all actions of the body are involved in that. So this is fun stuff. You can read all these. You don't need me to tell you. Emotions, urges, drives, this stuff. It is the seat of intellectual activity. Again, perception, recognition, debatable. Depends on who you read. I've read contrary to that statement, so who do you believe? All right. Many parts of the brain. We won't go into all of that, but the average size of the brain is between 2 and 4 pounds, and brains do shrink. Literally. And the thing is, part of aging can be due to loss of function due to brain shrinkage. And that's something that, you know, is also, again, being looked at. It says the basic cellular unit of a brain is called a neuron, okay? We have neurons. We have axons, which are little hair-like tendrils, which is where electrical conductivity, so the brain is electrical. It's a lot of electrical when you think about it, because a nerve transmission is an electrical signal that's being sent. The sending of those signals is done with what are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are very complex. You have a neurotransmitter, but then you also have a receptor. So every neurotransmitter has to have a receptor that can receive it, okay? Interestingly enough, neurotransmitters are manufactured from vitamins, minerals, proteins, and essential fatty acids. And they're coming about and they're being told what to produce based on other signals coming back to the body, because we have a feedback system that communicates back to the brain. So there we go. We have 5 exciting neurotransmitters, okay, and 2 calming neurotransmitters that have been identified, put it that way. 5 that excite and get things moving down the path, and 2 that have to keep it all in checks and balance. And there's many, 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 many things that set up excitatory activity in the brain, okay? Things that come from food, things that come from chemicals, things that you can smell. These are all substances that can instigate activity at a brain level. Some good, some bad. So we talk about the calming neurotransmitters first. These are some compounds that you might be familiar with, you might not be familiar with. So when we talk about GABA, it's called gamma-aminobutyric acid. Remember, there's no test. So GABA is a lot of times we have deficiencies. There's a class of drugs, the benzodiazepines. Many people are familiar with Valium and Ambien and things of that nature. They work on what is called the GABA receptor. Okay, many people have plenty of GABA neurotransmitter, but they have a defect or a deficiency in the receptor being able to receive GABA. So when we look at some of the pharmaceuticals that are being utilized, they're working in this metabolic pathway of GABA, and unfortunately, they have a fairly high addictive nature to them, because once a body gets on them, it's hard to get off of them because of that receptor and because of the way that it's circumventing certain things from happening in the brain. The other one that you might be very, very familiar with is serotonin. Serotonin is a very interesting neurotransmitter. It's what I call the feel-good neurotransmitter. So it has a calming effect, but when you feel pleasure, when you bite into that ripe peach and then you get that sensation of, oh, this is really good, that's kind of a serotonin kind of experience. So keep that in mind too. Serotonin is involved in all kinds of activity when we start to talk about how this works. So again, you might be familiar with a class of drugs called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. SSRIs came on board, probably 15, 18, maybe 20 years ago. And the interesting thing about serotonin is that your body produces serotonin from the amino acid tryptophan. Okay, tryptophan and melatonin help your body to produce serotonin. So what a drug does, like an SSRI, is it doesn't allow the metabolic breakdown of serotonin because it can fall apart very quickly in your brain. And then in a sense, you can have technically a deficiency, but you never have a deficiency of Prozac. Okay, so keep that in mind too. So serotonin, very good as a calming neurotransmitter. Okay. All right, here's a couple of our exciting neurotransmitters. Dopamine seems to be one that is being addressed an awful lot in the mental health arena because, again, it can affect motor, coordination, balance, muscle control. We have issues in dopamine, particularly in Parkinson's patients, okay? High levels, though, of dopamine can have a very manic effect on people, particularly people who tend to be what they call bipolar. And so when we look at that, we have to look and assess, well, what's going on in these kind of arenas with these neurotransmitters? What would be activating it up? Acetylcholine, which is a really neat one too, is what we deal with when we're talking about clarity of mind and the accessing of memory and being able to have that alertness. So sometimes we don't get enough acetylcholine. Acetylcholine only hangs around for a very short period of time, and then it degrades. So when we talk about Alzheimer's, we'll talk about a couple plants later on that are being used in Alzheimer's research and showing good benefit without being a pharmaceutical that are helping to keep more acetylcholine available so that the memory recall really works better. And there's many, many aspects there. Okay. Norepinephrine is another excited neurotransmitter. Works with heart, helps, when you get that stress response and your body gets that fight or flight syndrome because it's being signaled to do that. Epinephrine, norepinephrine are the two factors that can be in balance here. And of course, nitric oxide is an interesting kind of new kid on the block, kind of not necessarily sure if it's a neurotransmitter, but they know that nitric oxide is, and it's not nitrous, not what you get at the dentist, it's nitric. So anyway. Now, let's talk about brain-gut. This could be a whole lecture in itself. The same neurotransmitters that we just talked about in your brain are present in your digestive system. So when you get that gut reaction, that you kind of get this connectivity that says, oh, you might, whatever it happens to be. Majority of serotonin is in our digestive system. And it's some in the brain. So if every neurotransmitter exists in your brain, and if it also exists in your gut, we call that the enteric brain. Now, some of the disorders that we're talking about in this situation is that the newest information I've been reading is that the gut barrier, we have a lining. We have little microvilli. These little villi have a mucous membrane protective coating. And when they started comparing the gut mucosa to the blood-brain barriers, because the blood-brain barrier is only to allow certain things in because it needs to protect the brain from the onslaught of a lot of things that can be involving, being detrimental to the brain. So they found that there is about a 75% of the gut and the blood-brain barrier are the same makeup. There's about a 25% difference. And when you start to look at the gut digestive system, there's a syndrome called leaky gut syndrome. I've known about this for 25 years. This is when you have inflamed digestion and you have a digestive mucosa that has been damaged. We want to blame it on gluten. And the real culprit, I'm going to tell you right now, is not gluten. The real culprit is chemistry. pesticides, fungicides, all kinds of stuff that's been thrown into our food chain over the last 50 years has really taken its toll on the digestive systems of human beings. And the thing that we have to deal with is this is an inflammatory bowel syndrome that sets this up. But what leaky gut means is that, remember, our gut digestive system is a barrier. And the purpose of that barrier is to keep out things that aren't supposed to be in your body, right? So when that lining, I want you to think of these little fingers as little villi in your intestinal tract. There's approximately 400 trillion microvilli that live in your intestinal tract. That's more than how many cells are in your body, technically. But I don't know how they get that because, hundreds of trillions of cells. If you got 400 trillion little villi, they're cells too. These little villi are like little hairs, and they are one single cell thick. One single cell, microscopically, okay? In and around this mucus layer in these fingers is where our probiotics live. All right, we have an immune system that's right under the surface because there's blood supply here, because nutrient from your food is meant to be collected and passed through these little junctions called tight gap junctions. So every single cell bumps up like this. And what they're finding out is that pesticides like Roundup, glyphosate, DDT, which has been banned since the 70s. However, we eat food that still has DDT because they still use it worldwide. The bottom line is that these junctions start to separate. They're supposed to be tight to keep things out. But when they're no longer tight, they start to separate, and all of a sudden, a gluten protein, other things that we happen to eat escape and get into the bloodstream and trigger an immune response. And that's how that all works. So if we have a gut-brain relationship and we have a barrier that is almost, 75% the same, the potential for things crossing into the brain through, again, our bloodstream goes up sharply. Okay, so you got to keep that as a factor. So eating organic foods, I think I got a slide here. Yeah, avoiding GMOs and foods treated with glyphosate as well as all chemicals is the best way, so you want to look at more organics. The importance of maintaining good digestive function, proper gut flora, we've talked about probiotics till we're blue in the face, minimizing toxins, and this all has to do with, again, the entry point. This is all just entry point stuff. We're not even talking about what happens when it gets into the blood and goes to your liver. 5 pints of blood every 2 minutes.